Hello and welcome. It's great to see you all here today. We're just giving everyone a chance to settle in. As I mentioned, we want to welcome you to the virtual colloquium series In Conversation, Arts and Culture for Well-Being, organized by the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is James Pawelski, and I'm professor of practice and director of education in the Positive Psychology Center at Penn, and the founding director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us live and to those who are watching the recorded version of today's event. The mission of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project is to understand, assess, and advance the well-being benefits of engagement in arts and culture, focusing on individual and collective human flourishing. We're grateful for support from the Drew and H.J. Heinz II Charitable Trust and the National Endowment for the Arts, which has designated the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project as an NEA research lab and is supportive both of practice-informed research and of research-informed practice in the arts, culture, and well-being. You can find out much more about the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, including our publications and how to sign up for our newsletter, on our website at www.humanities-and-human-flourishing.org. Thank you, Sarah, for having just popped that into the chat. Today, we are thrilled to continue our colloquium series, which features presentations by and discussions between scientists and practitioners on topics concerning the arts, culture, and well-being. Before we turn to our distinguished speakers for today, though, let me preview the plan for this colloquium. We will begin by hearing two 20-minute presentations, one focusing on science and one focusing on practice. Then I will moderate a brief discussion with the speakers before opening it up to a Q&A with all of you. At any point during the session, feel free to enter questions or comments in the chat. If you would like to share these verbally, please wait until we open it up for audience participation toward the end of our time together, and then raise your Zoom hand. And with that, let's turn to our speakers. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Christa Mahlobo. Dr. Christa Mahlobo is a Penn Provost postdoctoral research fellow in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project at the Positive Psychology Center. Her work focuses on the intersection of race, ethnicity, and culture with flourishing through engagement in the arts and humanities. Before arriving at Penn, Christa earned her PhD at the Pennsylvania State University, where her dissertation focused on examining adolescent precursors to early adult flourishing in African Americans, specifically ethnic racial identity and socialization. She believes that the arts and humanities can be transformative, and she desires to expand the reach of programs that utilize the arts and humanities as tools for flourishing in communities of color. I'll just say on a personal note, it has been delightful to have Christa with us in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project team for the last couple of years. It's been really rewarding to work with Christa, and it's been exciting to see the directions in which she has continued to develop her work and continue to lead our investigations in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. So Christa, welcome. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us today.
Thank you so much for that introduction, James. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and please someone let me know if I'm good to go. Can everyone see this? Beautiful. Thank you. All right. I'm also going to set a timer because I can be long-winded and I want to keep to time. So thank you for joining us today. I wanted to talk to you about briefly one study that I did, but more a second study where I was focusing on some survey data that came out of just something that I was incredibly interested in around flourishing and the impact of arts engagement on well-being among Black Americans. Beautiful. So in a class that I'm teaching this year, I use music as curriculum because oftentimes art that's created by Black individuals, music in particular, has throughout history been more than just a tool for increasing hedonic well-being. Many artists like the late great Nina Simone have used their art as a way to tell stories about the social condition in the United States, particularly as a Black American. So Simone, through some of her more popular songs like I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free, which became an anthem during the Civil Rights Movement, used her art to disrupt these dogmatic ways of thinking and also to give a voice to the social and political struggles of the Black community. So through her art, she really emphasized the role of artists as truth tellers and change makers. And as I mentioned before, Black arts traditions, not just through Simone, but through artists over time, historically haven't just been used simply to feel good. A lot of Black arts traditions do have these other functions that I'll talk with us through. So the arts have been used as Angela Davis pointed out, tools for collective expression and collective desire, and also a way to preserve cultural memory. So I think a great example of that is in Western Africa, the griots were ancestral historians who were also artists. So they told stories through poems and singing and dancing to share the history of a set of people while also passing along current issues and events. And in many ways, I think it's super cool that this oral tradition actually carries itself on in modern day practices like hip hop and slam poetry as this practice of storytelling and bearing witness for many inner city Black youth. So the arts have also been used as a way to heal from the trauma of historical oppression and the transmutation of suffering. And by transmutation of suffering here, I mean suffering that is transformed into hope, strength, and sometimes even beauty. So Dr. Camilla Majid describes this process in Joyfully Just very well, specifically about how gospel music in the Black community has this function of healing and transforming suffering. So she says, transcending the legacy of bondage and ongoing exploitation and violence against us, Black people lift all spirits with Black spirituals. Black gospel music elevates the hopes of humanity and calls us to create an immovable resolve within, based on our inherent divinity and dignity, and the determination to see that dignity and divinity triumph. Declaring that we shall not be moved, we hold firm to our resolve to be free. So the arts in this community have also been described as these individual and community liberatory practices. So liberatory in this sense describes freeing up an individual, or the artist in this case, to say what they want and to express themselves, but also to reflect and give voice to the state of the whole community and any injustices that the artist may perceive as happening to that community. These practices are also embodied practices, and by embodied, I mean practices that incorporate your whole physical being, like the way that you can sort of feel these African drum beats in your heart. That invites embodied liberation through movement. And I think James Baldwin in this case says it really well. He says, all art is a kind of confession. All artists, if they are to survive, are forced at last to tell the whole story, to vomit the anguish up. And finally, for Black Americans, the arts can be subversive or counterculture. So many Black artists have made it their goal to challenge the American mainstream and the ways that Black lives are portrayed and valued. In many ways, they're doing this in order to increase ethnic pride and a healthy sense of ethnic racial identity. So the arts are also a wisdom tradition with justice at its core and really sometimes focus on resistance to subjugation. So despite attempts to devalue and even end Black lives, through arts engagement, many are given hope, strength, and resilience and are positively reinforced in their Black identity. And here Lucille Clifton says the best when she says, she was a poet, she said, "Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." So for me, knowing that some of the functions of engaging in the arts differ in this population, it also led me to want to explore whether there were differences in the outcomes of arts participation that might be unique to this group. So in particular, I've been focusing on and will be talking about for the rest of my talk the impacts of arts participation on these two dimensions of flourishing that have arrows next to it, so transcendent and collective flourishing. And I think these are two dimensions of well-being that often fall outside of what is commonly studied. We commonly look at the arts in regards to how they impact our interpersonal, our psychological, and maybe sometimes even our physical well-being. But these two dimensions, transcendent and collective well-being, really take on a heightened importance in Black Americans due to historical and social contexts, according to many scholars of Africana philosophy. So just to give a little bit of description of these two categories, transcendent flourishing refers to a sense of religiosity and spirituality that can look like a connection to a higher power or a connection with nature. And it often gives folks who have a healthy sense of transcendent flourishing a sense of meaning, purpose, and even awe or experiences with the divine. And historically, this is a really important dimension of flourishing that should be studied in Black Americans. First, because it has its roots in resilience and survival. So during slavery, religion, particularly Christianity, played a really crucial role in providing hope and a framework for resilience for many people. So enslaved Africans merged elements of their traditional spiritual practices with Christianity, which created a beautiful faith tradition that emphasized liberation as well as survival. And this religious foundation helped Black Americans endure extreme hardship and oppression. Also, it offered a sense of community, solidarity, and a hope for freedom, which leads into the second point that transcendent flourishing or religion or spirituality can be a source of empowerment and social justice specific to this community. So through the civil rights movement and beyond, the Black church became a central hub for activism and social justice. And many religious leaders that many of us are aware of, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, were instrumental in using faith to mobilize communities to action, to fight against injustice, and to advocate for the civil rights of the Black community. And finally, community and cultural identity is another piece of transcendent flourishing that's historically significant in this group. So for many Black Americans, religious institutions aren't just these spiritual spaces, but they're also cultural and social centers. So churches, mosques, and other religious spaces often are these community gathering spaces where people can access different social services. They're often also support systems, and sometimes they're even education centers through church schools. And these spaces help reinforce a healthy sense of shared and individual identity, of values, and of heritage. So this dimension serves a dual purpose of deepening connections with a higher power or divinity, but also plays a really active role in creating hope and coping with stressful events that the Black community has often had to face since the history of being in the United States. So the next dimension that I think is really important to cover is collective flourishing. And the best way to describe it is sort of through its dimensions. The first is a sense of sociocultural identity. So having a healthy sense of your cultural or ethnic group is one of the tenets of collective flourishing. The next is a sense of community connectedness. So having a connection with your ethnic racial group, and then also having pride in that identity is really key. And then finally, civic participation and engagement. So participating in the betterment of that group. And there are many scholars that have hypothesized and theorized about what civic participation or engagement looks like. And, you know, it can range all the way from sharing a post on social media about Black lives or the Black community, and it can go all the way to participating in protests. So just participating in the betterment of the group in some way is one of the tenets of collective flourishing. So keeping those two things in mind, there were two observable gaps in the literature. So the first is that arts participation in this population might be different because there are these different functions of arts engagement in the Black arts tradition. And then the second observable gap is that there may be unique flourishing outcomes of arts participation because of the different social and historical background or landscape for this community. So in particular, I didn't see as much work on transcendent and collective flourishing in this group. So I wanted to dig through the literature and figure out, what does the literature say about the role that the arts and humanities play in Black American flourishing? So I won't go into too much depth around the scoping review. I've chatted about it a couple of times, and if you have questions, I'm happy to share my findings with you there. But we started with an initial search, which pulled around 2,900, really closer to 3,000 studies. But after screening, 114 articles were included in the paper. And one of the major findings that I wanted to pull out and focus on was that collective and transcendent flourishing are dimensions that do take on this heightened importance in the Black American context, but they were underrepresented in this review in some arts and humanities domains. So to highlight the importance of it, there were multiple studies where Black television and film was correlated with healthy ethnic racial pride and identity. And these weren't just correlation studies. There were also some experimental studies where folks were asked to watch a Black television show or a film that featured Black characters in a positive light. And they were asked to do pre and post assessments of their sense of ethnic racial pride and identity. And those scores went up as a result of engaging in these television shows and these films. So that highlights that collective flourishing here is an important dimension that does really need to be studied in more depth. A similar thing can be said about transcendent flourishing. So there were, again, multiple studies that found a positive relationship between listening to gospel music, for example, which is very specific to the Black Christian faith community. So there's a positive relationship between listening to Black gospel music and a personally meaningful relationship with a higher power, highlighting again that transcendent flourishing is something that needs to be focused on a little bit more in depth. So that led me to a whole other set of research questions. So the first being, how are Black Americans currently engaging in the arts? So I looked at the literature before, but I was curious about, in 2024, how are Black Americans currently engaging in the arts? The second question that I had was, what is the impact of this engagement on flourishing, specifically in those last two dimensions that I spoke about? And then what are potential barriers to engagement? Because we know that barriers to going to art exhibits and art shows are very real. So I wanted to dig into what those might look like. So for the survey, we initially recruited 600 folks to take the survey. We had to drop a couple and we ended up with 596. Our survey requirements were that participants had to be 18 years or older and they had to identify as Black Americans. So we ended up getting folks from across the United States and across age ranges, which was pretty beautiful. I believe the median age range was 47. And the data were collected through Prolific. So there were a number of scales that we used because it was a survey, but I think three important ones to talk through were the scales that I used to measure flourishing. For the psychological scale, I used the mental health continuum short form, which is a pretty common one. It had 14 items. And then for transcendent and collective well-being, I used the multidimensional well-being assessment, which was created by Shelley Harrell. And this scale in particular was created to assess the well-being context that many Black Americans experience, which is why we were, lucky enough that it had these dimensions of well-being that are really important to Black Americans. So for transcendent wellness, the questions were asked on a 5-point Likert scale, and the questions looked like asking folks to answer, my faith and spiritual beliefs are strong, or I felt loved by and in a closer relationship with a higher power or God in my life. And then for collective well-being, there were questions around folks responding to, I felt secure and grounded by my roots and my culture, or another group in society important to my identity. Or questions like, I felt strongly and emotionally connected to my culture or another group in society that's important to me. And there were 12 items on that scale. So for the first question, how are Black Americans currently engaging in the arts? So there were a lot of findings from the survey. It was a decently long survey. So I'm just hitting on the high points today. But again, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. But we asked a question about 30-day art engagement. We asked, what are folks doing over the course of 30 days? And it looks like music was the thing that most folks said that they were engaging in over the past 30 days, which is unsurprising because of how ubiquitous music is and how easy it is to access. The second most popular thing that folks were engaging in was television and film. The third most popular were the visual arts. And then the fourth most popular was engaging in writing and literature. So the second part of, or the second question that I had is, what is the impact of engagement on flourishing? And there were a couple of different ways that I asked this, but there were two ways that I wanted to highlight today that I ended up doing some regressions and trying to figure out what the relationship looked like. So the first was, what is the relationship between art engagement by domain, so domain-specific art engagement, on psychological, collective, and transcendent flourishing? And there were a couple of significant findings here. So in terms of psychological flourishing, engagement in dance and theater emerged as significant positive predictors of psychological flourishing, while engaging in television and film and writing and literature actually emerged as negative predictors of psychological flourishing. For collective flourishing, there were no significant relationships between the different art domains and collective flourishing. And then for transcendent flourishing, music, dance, and theater positively predicted transcendent flourishing, while writing and literature negatively predicted transcendent flourishing. And I'll get into a little bit of why that might be when we move into the discussion. So the next set of questions that I asked was, what is the relationship between motivations for art engagement and psychological, collective, and transcendent flourishing? So for motivations for art engagement, we asked participants to answer the question, I engage in activities related to the arts because ... These activities increase my functioning in regards to cognition, emotions, social functioning, or activism. And for psychological flourishing, we found no significant relationships between art motivation and psychological flourishing. For collective flourishing, however, there was a significant positive relationship between participating in the arts for cognitive, social, and activism reasons and collective well-being. And then finally, for transcendent flourishing, if folks indicated that they participated in the arts for cognitive reasons and social reasons, those emerged as significant predictors of transcendent flourishing. So the final question that I asked folks on the survey was about their barriers to art engagement. So the first question was, thinking about the most recent art performance that you would have attended, what were some of the factors that caused you to not attend? And the most common response was that it cost too much, which really speaks to a structural barrier that arts museums and art spaces could think about what resources could look like to encourage engagement. The second most common was that folks said that they could not find the time. And the third was another structural barrier, which is that it was too difficult to get there. So we asked not just about barriers, but also what kind of changes can be made to make these organizations better for you in the future. And folks said that more affordable entry or ticket prices would be really helpful in order to have folks want to come to these different organizations. And also if they were more welcoming to all kinds of people and had more culturally diverse exhibits and events. And finally, we asked about different social issues. So the arts can be used, again, for hedonic pleasure and entertainment, but also we were curious, do people care if the arts actually hit on social issues? And it looks like they did. For the most part, folks indicated that they would want to see exhibits around systemic racial injustices, also mental health stigma and income equality and the wealth gap. So these are sort of hot button topics that people also wanted to see reflected in the art that they engaged in. And the final thing that I wanted to talk quickly through was that we asked some qualitative questions as well. We asked, what are some visible and invisible signs that make you feel welcome in an art space? So we wanted to ask these questions because there's an aspect of inclusion and belonging that might not be as visible to the naked eye. So we really wanted to chat through what that meant. And these are just a couple of themes that we saw, but folks said that if they saw some physical signs of welcome when they walked into a space, that would help them feel more welcome. So seeing LGBT or BIPOC flags, provided resources, so subsidizing ticket schemes so that it's more affordable, and then a sense of diversity and belonging. So seeing other people that look like them, whether that be the staff or through the art visuals on the actual walls, would be helpful. And then to quickly talk through some of the results. So when looking at the survey, it looked like participation in different art domains did impact different dimensions of flourishing. So dance and theater, for example, significantly positively predicted psychological and transcendent flourishing, while writing and literature, for some reason, significantly negatively predicted psychological and transcendent flourishing. And when I was looking through the literature, some folks said that this may be because writing and literature do involve this level of deep reflection that can actually cause an increase in society, which might explain why it might decrease folks' sense of well-being. And finally, different motivations for art participation also predicted different flourishing outcomes. So we saw that if folks said that their motivation was activism, this was related to a higher sense of collective flourishing, which makes sense. And then also if they were motivated to participate in the arts for cognitive or social reasons, this was related to a higher sense of collective and transcendent flourishing. For the barriers part of the survey, we saw that both structural and social barriers exist to arts engagement. So in terms of price accessibility and content, these are just things that we hope through this survey insights, recommendations can be given to art galleries and museums around designing more inclusive spaces that increase visitation and subsequent flourishing in this population. My hope here, my desire for the arts and for people's participation in the arts is to help people think critically about and question their experiences and those of others. So I hope that we were able to get into a little bit of that today. I know that I'm over time, so thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christa. That was really fascinating. I think we should have scheduled an hour or two for you to go through all of those details, which are really, it's a lot to sink our teeth into and to discuss, which we will do momentarily. So thank you for that. But for now, though, I want to turn to our second speaker, and we will hear from Rachell Morillo. Rachell Morillo is a Black feminist artist, educator, and writer with deep ties to the Dominican Republic and New York City, and also Philadelphia, because that's where she lives. Through both her practice as an educator and personal creative practice, Rachell crafts conditions to safely unlearn oppressive systems and create new possibilities. She's currently the Director of Public Engagement and Research at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, where she oversees the production of the museum's full range of public offerings across audiences, designs the visitor experience, and brokers new relationships with cultural leaders and organizations on Penn's campus and throughout the city of Philadelphia. Her writing practice is dedicated to uplifting, studying, and preserving art, artifacts, and ideas of the Black Atlantic. Her writing has appeared in Hyperallergic, Intense Art Magazine, SEEN Journal, as well as the Studio Museum's Black Refractions and Fictions catalogs. Rachell earned a BA in Sociology and Anthropology from Swarthmore College. Rachell, it's really delightful to have you with us. We've had some great conversations over the last few years, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you will be sharing with us today.
Thank you, James. Yes, I'm so grateful to be here. And thank you to you and to Sarah for the invitation. I really always feel so enriched by our conversations. And so I'm really glad to be here and especially to connect with you, Christa. I know that when we talked a couple of weeks ago, there was so much synergy that it got me super excited for this conversation. So I will start sharing screen. If someone can let me know.
We are good. We can see it. Fantastic.
Actually, 1 second. I'm having technical issues on my end. There we are. So we're doing well. You all can see. Yeah, I think James, you did an awesome job introducing me. I just also wanted to add a few things. And get into kind of the nitty-gritty of what I do. And so when I say that I'm a cultural producer, I really mean that I create opportunities for people to engage their own creativity and connect with each other. And so that is through our public programming, but again, as we mentioned, our visitors experience. So yeah, thinking through exactly how we would want people to feel in the space beyond just wanting to feel welcomed, but how do we really get people into the space and wanting to stay and connect with each other? As an educator, I develop resources to enhance people's experience and understanding of art. And so that's really the didactic materials that you see around the museum, whether that be the labels on the wall or some of the other resources, which I'll get to later in the presentation. And then I really come to this work because I'm an artist myself. I am a writer, a photographer, occasional ceramicist, and I like to believe that, I bring that creativity along with me into this work. I'm sorry if you see my cat, she's decided she wants to join this conversation as well. So when I was thinking about today's presentation, I really wanted to start with some quotes from people, educators, writers who have really helped shape my approach to designing inclusive programming in art spaces. And so bell hooks, of course, came to mind. She writes, to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. Here she's establishing the role of the educator as one that designs the environments where true, deep, intimate learning can happen. And that to do this successfully, we must start by honoring all that people bring to these experiences, right? So we start with respect and acknowledging the expertise and the experience of people, and then act with care. So for me, that means really remaining present and attuned to the needs of the room. And it requires a lot of listening, getting to know those you're sharing space with. It also requires that I not think of myself as gifting an audience awareness or appreciation for art, but instead embracing and supporting the creativity and knowledge already in the room. It's really only then that true knowledge exchange can happen. It's only then that we can create room for transformational experiences. I would add that undergirding this quote is also the assertion that continual learning is what keeps us human, keeps us flourishing. It's a lifelong and natural process. And the last thing that I'll add here too is, I think at its essence, Hooks's writing on education advocates for shifting away from a model of correction. So instead of thinking that you're going to be improving the lives or changing the lives of the people that are coming into the space, to really affirming participants' own agency and experiences. Go. Another really central piece of writing that shaped my time as an educator has been emergent strategy. I actually had the pleasure of participating in the Emergent Strategy Institute's facilitator training in August of 2020. And it's just been, in retrospect, it's been such an essential part of how I've continued to navigate doing this work in times of crisis, especially. There is a lot to take in from this book, where Adrienne Maree Brown expands on Octavia Butler's work to develop a praxis for navigating the world in a way that acknowledges its constant change. But the starred points here are the ones that I think really are guiding my programming work in particular. And so when I think about this quote that says, "There is a conversation in the room that only these people at this moment can have, find it." For me, in developing a program, I'm asking myself, what makes this program or experience special? What are we adding to the conversation in creating this program? What do the people in the room want to get out of this program? And then in thinking about less prep, more presence, it's one that I often say to the team, because my philosophy is that in programming, you can prepare all you want, but something and probably everything can go wrong on the day of. So it's really about how can we remain nimble and flexible? How can I remain present in order to learn from and help shape the changes that are happening in the room? And then lastly, I would say never a failure, always a lesson is definitely a guiding star for me, in that I am constantly pushing for us to keep innovating, and to understand moments of quote unquote failure, moments of conflict as learning opportunities, right? As another opportunity for us to grow as individuals. And then lastly, this quote is one that I return to again and again. I had the pleasure of working with artist and educator Carrie Downey during their tenure as an educator at MoMA's community partnership programs. In this paper, which was published in the Journal of Museum Education, Carrie makes clear how museums are activated and transformed through educators' labor in particular, essentially leveraging their expertise and essentially leveraging their expertise to connect museums and local communities who have been historically and systemically oppressed. So thinking about people of color, queer people, people with disabilities, and all of the intersections therein. This moment that I've underlined here again goes back to that Octavia Butler quote, where what we are doing as educators is really supporting and dignifying people's lives, right? How can we make sure that people are walking away with a sense of pride in who they are and an affirmation that they had everything that they needed in order to be able to navigate the space, that this is really meant to just be another experience where they're practicing and enacting their agency, their everyday agency. Oops. And so in the article, Carrie talks about educators as a handle, which I think is such a lovely image, right? To think about a handle as something that is an opening into a portal, into a particular experience, but also it's lending not only entry, but a chance for connection and support. I think is really at the heart of how I approach programming. And so really, where am I inviting people to at this point in time? For those who aren't familiar, the ICA, or the Institute of Contemporary Art, is on the corner of 36th and Sansom. I used to be able to say we're right across the street from the Urban Outfitters, but now that's no longer true. We are a place to encounter diverse perspectives and be in dialogue around our shared humanity and evolving futures, as much as we are a place to get to know the artists and art of our time, right? I would be remiss if I didn't sneak this plug in here, which is to say that we have 3 really amazing exhibitions up right now. They're all very different, where I learned to look Art from the Yard being a group show with over 30 artists that are thinking about and making art that's reflective of the yard in all its senses. And then we have a solo show by a photographer named Joanna Piotrowska, and a design on the facade of our building, which you can kind of see here, but really it's so much better experience in person, by Nonsi Kalelo Mutiti. And all of these are up through December 1st. So I hope if you haven't been, that you'll come join us. Generally, ICA is a place of possibility, a launch pad for contemporary art and ideas. So what does that really mean? At its core, we believe collaboration creates a more resilient, thriving, and joyous world. And so we're working together with artists, with community partners, with all of our stakeholders. And at the end, we're looking to make an impact on the world. We believe learning and creative thinking are foundational to how we grow as individuals and collectively evolve. And so I see my own values reflected in this statement on learning, in that for me, really what we're talking about is how do we reach what you so greatly called, Christa, collective and transcendent flourishing as individuals and in community. And then lastly, we believe experimentation leads to the freedom necessary for cultural transformation. So we're constantly innovating, constantly looking for new and more effective ways to do what we're aiming to do. And so I thought I would start by kind of delving deep into some of our programming models that I feel are maybe a bit different or unexpected from what people would expect from an art space, but specifically one with the word institution in the name. I want to acknowledge that to be doing this work in a time of crisis during a pandemic and multiple genocides means arts institutions have an opportunity to thrive and ensure their future sustainability if we broaden our idea of what our typical audience is, right? So who we would typically see at an arts institution, which, as Christa alluded to, oftentimes marginalized or minoritized folks are not necessarily seeing themselves reflected in the content or even in the space of art museums. But also what is most notable is that, along with questioning, I would say, so many of the different forms of institutions that we currently have, people are really holding arts institutions in particular accountable to seeing themselves reflected in this point in time. And so how do we rise to meet that moment and those concerns? For me, sometimes this means becoming something other than institutional, something kind of unmuseum-like. And so our response as a team really, I would say, starts with these offerings that I call sometimes lightning rod programs. And so they're very large scale programs. Typically, we're talking about our opening celebrations. We've also started to do what are called later at ICA. So it's more of like a happy hour moment. And then we also have done a few deep listening sessions. And so those are really musical performances. I think I was not surprised when Christa shared the numbers in terms of where people's attention currently is. Music, I think, has always been a really big connector for Black folks in particular, and I would say even more broadly for most humans. In bringing musicians in conversation with artists, what we're doing is building these joyous moments where people can share space with friends and family, and oftentimes with the artists themselves. But for me, it's kind of like the spoonful of sugar method. We always sneak in a kind of educational component. And so in this particular opening, this was our opening last fall. Not only did we have great food and an amazing DJ, but we also brought in they're a Bombi Plena group. So it's a Puerto Rican folk dance group that's based in Philly and has been doing educational work here for over 10 years. The intention there was to bring out aspects of the artist's practice that may have been visible to people who were from that culture and not as familiar to others. And so thinking about also how we bridge conversations between the marginalized or minoritized audiences that museums are looking to bring in now, I would say, and who has typically been there, right? That it's not about one replacing the other. It's really about how do we bring folks in conversation with each other. Going back to some of the quotes at the beginning, these programs really, for me, are about ensuring that people feel seen. And so selecting that group, making sure that there was food that was reflective of the artist's culture as well. And inviting opportunities for people to engage in an embodied way. So thinking through dance in that way. It's really about affirming what people are already bringing to the space and making sure that they feel pride in that. Another key programming model that we've started to revisit recently are our mindfulness programs. This image is actually from 2021, I want to say, so it predates my time at ICA, but we are bringing it back in what's called Sunday reset programs, and so they're really opportunities for us to learn from and engage with mindfulness practitioners in Philadelphia specifically, and then also provide a respite for folks, which is something that time and time again, I would say, folks of color, queer folks have been asking of institutions and just collective gathering spaces more generally, is for them to be kind of a solve or a reprieve from some of the issues that they face on a day-to-day basis. I just wanted to point your attention to Culture Track and their, I would say, yearly reports at this point. They did a couple of studies that looked at the impact of COVID-19 on the arts district or on the arts sector specifically. There's a lot in there, and there's a lot that echoes what Christa has said. But I wanted to point our attention to this particular slide where they asked people what it is that they're looking for in cultural experiences generally. And so you'll see that they've color coded it based on people seeking fun and lighthearted or beautiful experiences, challenging or thought-provoking experiences. And so when you look at why people are going to an art museum, it's to encounter something beautiful, to have an emotionally powerful experience, and to be challenged, or to encounter something that's thought-provoking. I want to add the fun and lighthearted in there because as Christa was sharing, I think that it's great when people have emotionally powerful experiences, but to also understand that for some, that's going to be anxiety inducing, right? And so when we're thinking about kind of the broadest audiences that we can reach for, right? I think for me, it's about making sure that we're hitting these notes, these individual notes, so that each of the people that are being called by or to those experiences will feel welcomed and held in the space. I'll also emphasize this other study that they did, which was called Black Voices for the Evolution of Culture and Creativity. They actually did not have as many participants as Christa, so I say go with her numbers, but you'll see that there's actually a lot of alignment, especially in the point of thinking more broadly about what art and creativity can mean, right? That for Black folks, and I would say for a lot of people of color in particular, it's not just fine art or painting and drawing as we would have guessed, right? But that even things like practicing Black culture, right? Things that are everyday, things that are really intuitive for a lot of people are considered a part of that creativity. And so as arts institutions, as spaces that champion and support creative work, we should really be thinking more broadly about how we do our work. So to summarize some of the takeaways from doing these kinds of large scale joyous programs, I would say, yes, keeping things free and open really reduces one of the biggest barriers, I would say, to entry for cultural spaces. I add open because in addition to um, fees being a huge barrier, I would say the thought or the anxiety around not being fully prepared or not knowing what to do in the space can actually drive a lot of people away. And so at ICA, we're proud to say that admission is always free, including to all of our programs. Thanks to a generous donor, we're able to keep that for the time being. But then beyond that, I would say to create programs that are generous and joyful really is my approach to ensuring that people know that there's not necessarily anything that they need to bring. You don't need to even bring your own snacks. You don't need to think about paying for anything when you're in our space. Not only that, but what I mean by generous is really like offering ample opportunities for people to engage in the way that feels right. And so whether that's through the food that's there, including a hands-on engagement component, including more didactic or like talk-based programs, and always an opportunity to socialize and mingle with the people that you're sharing space with are really central to how we approach programming. And then lastly, looking at culturally affirming programs, right? That for me, it's never beneficial to think about a general audience, that as specific as you can get, the more folks will feel welcomed in. And that is really essential to the point that I was making earlier about ensuring that people are feeling seen, validated, and affirmed by the spaces that we're creating. This is particularly important for folks who are coming from minoritized backgrounds or marginalized backgrounds, because it's not often that we encounter spaces where we feel celebrated and seen in that way. But also to go back to Chris's point, that it can have a significant impact on people's individual and collective flourishing. Another, I think, point of intersection with your presentation was thinking through what's visible and invisible about how we do our work. And so I would say those programs are definitely a moment when we shine. Now we've started to see a lot of repeat visitors. I love that we've gotten people on dates, people celebrating their birthdays. We're becoming known as a space where people want to bring their friends. They know that they'll have an enjoyable time. And none of that really would be possible without the folks that you're seeing in this picture. There's a lot of people missing, but to think about the labor of the arts workers and educators in our space is super important. This picture is special for a number of reasons. It's from a program that we did last December where we built a photo set inspired by David Antonio Cruz, the exhibiting artist at the time's paintings. And so it offered visitors a chance to step into his world. But the idea was that you could bring anyone that you considered family to the space. And so at the end of the night, all of us who were working took this picture. I have thoughts about calling your coworkers family, but I think what it pointed to at that moment for me is that we are able to show up as our full selves. We all acknowledge and respect the contributions that we each make to the work that we're doing collectively, and that we're unified in our approach. And that's really essential. And it might not be something that folks are aware of when they come into the space on a daily basis, but it definitely, I would say, is one of the invisible cues that we're giving in terms of in terms of making people feel welcome in the space. And so to break down kind of the more invisible, or I would say structural ways that we're supporting an inclusive visitor experience and arts programming experience. I would say creating a community of practice. And so all of our front of house staff, we get together, we go through trainings together, we have conversations about the art together, we process any challenges that we're having at work together. One of the big changes that I made in coming on was that I also brought in the pool of who we were hiring. And so as part of the university, we were often hiring students. And I also think that this is an important job opportunity for practicing artists in Philadelphia. And so in hiring more folks who maybe weren't students, but were coming from an art background or coming from background as an educator, we've been able to build a community of practice where we're sharing resources and exchanging knowledge based on our individual strengths. I would also say that another key aspect is what I'm calling resource curiosity. And so thinking really broadly about what didactic resources can look like in an art space. I think people sometimes are really put off by wall text, right? And so what are the other opportunities that we have to make sure that people have the resources to understand and explore the artwork in the ways that they would like to? And for me, it's about thinking about multiple points of entry, knowing that there are different types of learners. There are people who are going to want a more embodied experience. There are people who really do need the facts and want the full Wikipedia page for the artist, right? And so this picture here is of our book cart, which is up on our mezzanine. We curate a selection of books based on the exhibitions up at the time, and they really range from photo books to children's books to more theory to our historical text. So there's a range there for a variety of learners again. We've also experimented now with taking the wall text off the wall. And so if you come to visit our space, the Joanna Piotrowska show upstairs actually doesn't have any wall text. Instead, we've created a booklet that has prompts for people to engage with their own feelings as they're processing what they've just seen. And then again, when I think about long-term goals and how we ensure that a lot of the experimentation that my team is doing now and a lot of the changes that we're making have a life that goes beyond my time at the institution, any of our time in the institution, but also how we ensure that this is an experience that people are having consistently, is to make sure that we're all on the same page. So institution-wide dedication to creating inclusive and affirming spaces. This is just a summary. So this is kind of like the visible strategies for designing affirming arts programming: free and open, culturally affirming, and generous and joyful. And then some of the more invisible. So creating a community of practice, institution-wide dedication, and resourced curiosity. I'm gonna skip this quote, even though I love it. And I'll just, because I know I'm over time, I'll just plug these programs that we have. So you actually have an opportunity to come check out a later at ICA yourself. Tonight, we'll be there from 6 to 9. We've partnered with Blue Stoop, an amazing writers collective here in Philly, to bring some in-gallery poetry readings to the space. And then we'll have a DJ set by DJ Julesy. On Sunday, you'll have an opportunity to hear directly from the artist and curator of Art from the Yard, Where I Learned to Look, in a performance and conversation. People are really excited because Jeff Koons is coming, so plugging that there. And then we have a couple of more programs in October, which I think also like shows the full range of how we're thinking about balance, right? So we've got a kind of like happy hour at the top, a more formal performance and conversation program. There's going to be a day-long afternoon of programming, thinking about protective styling, so braids, and design, and how that has impacted and been impacted by Black practitioners. in honor of Entryways Notsi Kalelo Mutiti. And then we have a film series that we've kicked off this season, and the next one actually features a talk back with the artist, Joanna Pietrowska. So just some dates to keep in mind. And then I'll leave this here for anyone who wants to connect. Like I said, we're on 36 in Sansom. We're open Wednesday through Sunday, 12 to 6 p.m. I'd love to see you at any of our programs, or just in our galleries more generally.
Wow, thank you so much, Rachel. That was really fascinating. A lot of richness there. I and my team have certainly enjoyed our visits to the ICA. So thank you for that. And we look forward to many more as well. So let's just dive in. Christa, I'm just curious to ask, as you were listening to Rachel's presentation, there were many points of intersection, some of which Rachel pointed out, but I'm just curious what's on your mind as you listen to her talk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rachel. This is why I love practitioners. Everything that we sit and theorize about, you all do. And I think it's just such a beautiful, reaffirming way to say that, my research in some ways matters and informs practice as well. I think, a couple of things stood out to me when I was thinking about how I would summarize this. I thought, you really gave us a how-to guide on how to work with people. And one of the things that I often preach to students and researchers is this idea of community-based participatory research, which is the practice of getting to know the community first before doing any research on or with them. And I know in the disability world, there's a lot of talk of nothing about us without us. And it feels like that's a lot of what you do in the ICA space. So there's this umbrella of cultural humility that all of your practices fall under, which I really love. There were also a couple of other things that really stood out to me, which is it felt like you proposed this intersectional equity approach to placemaking by using different diverse cultural. So by cultural, I mean like making visible folks who are traditionally invisible in some of these institutions and places. You also made it communal by making it feel invitational and really touching on all of the senses. So I can speak from personal experience. I went to the Swarm opening by Terrence. I'm forgetting the last name. Yes, by Terrence Nance, exactly. And all of my senses were were firing off at the same time. So I believe there was like a place where you can get your aura photographed, and there was dance, and there was music, and there was this ability to connect with different folks that I wouldn't have had the chance to do, which I thought was so lovely. It just really you created an environment that made it feel like home in some ways. And then also bringing in contemplative traditions, so presencing, mindfulness, and embodied practices through dance. All of those things center what the people themselves bring into spaces. And I think that's why when you walk away, it leaves this really lasting impression. So just appreciate all the work you do. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. I'm glad this is being recorded because you did such a beautiful job of summarizing and then giving language to my approach. And I think that's also why I was so excited when we first spoke, because as much as you're like, okay, you take what we study and you put it in practice, I think one thing that we talked about is how necessary having these studies that you're doing is, especially to arts organizations that are constantly vying for funding, that are really thinking or really need to not justify, but really give move with intentionality when it comes to how we spend our resources, right? To have my perspective. So I've been doing this work now for about 10 years, really validated, because I go based on feeling for the most part, right? I think most of the time when people ask me, or there's like this idea of me as having some sort of clairvoyance, which I don't think is true when it comes to like how we set up a space, right? And so there are times where I'll get called in and they're like, yeah, but what do you think? Like, what should we tweak? And most of the time what I'm doing is just, I guess, acting as like a tuning fork, right? So I like go in the space and I think about what it's going to be like to move through the space and what the experience is going to be like. And then I think about people who I ask who isn't in the room, who haven't we thought about in designing this, and I make sure that at the least we're not adding to the barriers for them to be in the space, right? So yeah, I'm really grateful for the work that you do as well.
So I love this interaction, and one of our guests, Rebecca Taylor, notes perfectly paired synergistic presentations, research and practice, affirming and informing one another. Thank you, Rachel and Christa, for your wonderful work and for being so generous to share it with us this morning. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I love the richness that was in each presentation. And at the end of each one, I'm just like thinking, oh my goodness, there's so much, just like bursting with information, with perspectives and so on. And which of course reminds me of what I feel like when I go to the ICA. It's a really rich experience. And I love that it's synergistic, right? It's rich in different kinds of ways. And so Christa, your point about, you study this from a scientific and empirical perspective, and it's nice to see people actually, what it looks like. It's kind of like when you put flesh on the skeleton, right? And you actually see the real living creature. On the other hand, Rachel, I hear you saying that you're doing these things, and if you go to the ICA and you have an open mind, you're likely to get it. But if you don't go to the ICA, or you are somebody who has, control over budgets and other things, and you don't get the argument, you don't feel it or whatever, sometimes you need these numbers or these more kind of analytical ways of understanding what's going on. Or you may just feel, well, I get it, does anybody else, right? And so having these large groups of people that are being studied, as Christa has done, can be helpful. I wonder, Rachel, just if you could follow up with, I know you were just talking about the value of work that folks like Christa do for validating what you're doing. I also note that you guys are like, spot on in terms of accessibility, right, Christa? Like you've nailed that one, thanks to your connections and your generous donor. What are some other things that that struck you about Christa's talk, either in terms of what you are already doing, or maybe kind of inspiring you for what you'd like to go, where you'd like to go next at the ICA?
Yeah, well, definitely doing more quantitative research about our audiences. We often get like word of mouth feedback, but there is such fertile ground here. And for me, as a Black woman in these spaces, it's so important that I also see myself reflected in the audiences that we're bringing in. And so Black audiences in particular have always been a huge priority for me. I just would love to learn how to do that better. And I think a key to that is maybe partnering with more folks like you who can help us structure what that looks like in a way that isn't like your typical survey, which I know, James, is also like something that we talked about way in the beginning when I got here. But yeah, I think when I was sitting through your presentation, Christa, the question that I wrote down was really, what has been the response to your work, right? I think that in addition to the barriers that individuals feel in coming in to these spaces, I guess I wonder if there are barriers for you having your work seen and understood, or implemented and enacted in the ways that you'd like it to be.
Christa, before you respond, let me just note that we're at that time where we welcome folks to raise your Zoom hand if you would like to chime in. You can always add something to the chat, or if you'd like to raise your Zoom hand to make a comment or ask a question, feel free to do that now. After Christa's response, we'll turn to those and see if anybody would like to chime in. So Christa, go for it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I will say that the response has been generally overwhelmingly positive. I think particularly what It was a question that you asked, and I'll word it a little bit differently, but you said who isn't in the room. And for me, the room is who isn't in the literature, who isn't in the theories, and why, and what's missing. So there's a lot of questions around which theories and who is missing from the creation of those theories. And I think what people get most excited about when I am giving these presentations is remember those two gaps that I talked about in the literature? Folks have, particularly Black folks, have experienced the Black art traditions and have known for generations that it's felt like more than just we make music to make music, or we make art to make art. There are always this plethora of reasons that, or functions that feel like beyond doing something for the sake of doing something. So I think bringing light to those has been something that a lot of people appreciate and really resonate with, and now have words that they can go back and give to funders or folks who need a case to be made for why these Black art traditions are so important. And then I think for the second part of it, because, you know, I have been in the world of flourishing and well-being research for such a long time. Again, for many years, we've known that well-being hasn't just felt like a sense of purpose in our work or maybe in our families, but also there's this very spiritual and deep, very indigenous tie to nature and this other sort of worldliness. And then same with collective flourishing for a lot of people of color. And though my race is specific to Black individuals, people of all marginalized backgrounds, whether that be based on race or gender or ability, have oftentimes felt like their existence hasn't just been for the purpose of individual well-being, but also for lifting up the community with us. So I think bringing that into the room has been just a really positive thing that, again, now has this utilitarian use where people can say, hey, there are these extra reasons why we might need to add this into the work that we're doing, much like you're already doing. I'm not the first person to theorize or talk about this. I'm just really excited about talking about it in art spaces.
Terrific. Thank you, Christa. That's, you know, we're all excited too on both sides of this, and especially in the intersection or the synergy, as Rebecca said, that collaboration feels like a really important place to be. I see we've got a hand raised. Trisha, it's great to see you. Welcome. What's on your mind today?
Oh, I'm so happy to be here and that these conversations are happening. Thank you so much for having these. I'm just so excited for all of them. And Rachel, as a practitioner myself, I'm just so grateful to be learning from you. I'm going to be looking up the emergent strategies and how you're creating spaces. There was one part of that, the trust people, or move at the speed of trust, I think it was. And that's just so beautiful. I love that. So thank you for sharing. My questions for Christa. In the research, there was a part where there's negative correlation, I think that's the word, the predictors of psychological well-being with music, theater, and TV. And later on, there was an aspect of writing, and the thought was that because it induces anxiety for bringing up, is it the similar correlation, would you say, for music and theater and TV, that it's invoking that anxiety, or what?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for that finding, the negative relationship was between TV and film, not music, theater. Yeah, but I mean, for TV and film, I think James, you've used this analogy before, that not all art is healthy art. Some of it is junk food. And I think that if since I didn't ask what kind of TV or what kind of films folks were watching, it could be that they were consuming a lot of junk food in a sense, and that didn't impact their psychological flourishing positively.
Okay. And then Rachel, can I follow up with a question for you based on that response? Whenever you're cultivating space with art, and I struggle with this as a musician, and suggesting that people might want to put good food, good healthy stuff into the world and not just the junk. Is that something that would influence your creation of space and the artists that you're inviting in? Is that kind of element of like psychological wellness or reflection of culture and things that would support that flourishing, collective flourishing?
It definitely, I don't think I would have used the same terms just because I'm not a scientist or a doctor. But yes, it is something that we often think about in programming. I work in relationship with the exhibitions that are on view and also the curators that are selecting the artists that will be on view, right? So I'm not often in charge of making that decision, but instead of responding to it. But I think that I have so many options for how I respond, even if there isn't necessarily work that on the surface aligns with these goals, there's always an opportunity to kind of triangulate an experience, right? So instead of bringing in someone to be in dialogue around the exhibition that is doing almost exactly the same work, like, can I do what's been done here, right? Can I bring in a completely different perspective, and what opportunities does that create for people? I think it also factors into how I think about like balancing a programmatic season, right? And so making sure that yes, there are these moments where you're like kind of in a phantasmagoria, like you're being overwhelmed in terms of your senses, and that there are quieter moments for contemplation, right? To include variety in there gives people agency and choice within that. What else came up? Does that answer your question, by the way?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Trisha. It's great to see you, and thanks for that question. I see Rebecca has her hand up. Before we turn to you, Rebecca, though, just quickly, a couple of chats that have come in. Sheila wonders whether anxiety and connection to writing might be due to educational practices. I've never experienced anything negative with regard to writing and education, so I don't know what Sheila is talking about. Ha ha. So having had negative past experiences in the educational system could certainly have something to bear there. I think also with writing, you know, as you said, Christa, there's that possibility that engaging in arts and culture can be merely kind of like junk food, which can be okay from time to time. But if we're just stuck in that and using it as really a way of escaping, an escapist kind of approach may not be useful. There's also a kind of possibility of wallowing, right? And sometimes, you know, if we listen to music that is just making us wallow, it's like wiggling a loose tooth. You like wiggle and wiggle and wiggle and you keep at it. Or writing can be a kind of, and then, oh, this part is awful and that's awful and this is terrible, and let me see how I could put that in a story, which again, it's important to have those moments of being able to be authentic, obviously, and to sit with our feelings and our thoughts. And you know, we want to metabolize them, perhaps, or we want to kind of work through them or with them. And sometimes we can get stuck. And I think, I wonder whether that may be a part of it as well. Just super quick before we turn to Rebecca, Tony Junius wonders, Christa, there's a difference between how you define flourishing or well-being. Can you just address that quickly?
Yeah, I use them pretty interchangeably when I'm talking orally. When I'm writing, I typically stick with flourishing. So one of the things that I think the HHF project in general likes to talk about is the difference between ill-being and well-being. And I think that for me, I wrap those two things up into flourishing because it's a little bit of both. This is maybe more of a Buddhist perspective, but life can't be lived without suffering. So figuring out how those two can coincide and still feel like an individual is flourishing or thriving is something that's really important. So to make a long story short, use the two interchangeably.
Perfect. Thank you, Christa. Rebecca, can we turn to you and please share what's on your mind?
Yeah, I had just wanted to propose another theory and see how it resonated with your data, Christa. Sometimes, not in regard to TV, but in regard to the writing and even some of the other correlations we might see with visual art, sometimes things affect us really powerfully and emotionally, and it's negative in the moment, but we might find Aristotelian value in the long term. So sometimes it's a state of negative well-being, psychological well-being in the short term that actually might yield long-term positive benefits. I just wondered if that was possible within the forum. I don't know about the questions you asked, maybe there was no room to even know that, but just as a possible way of reading the data.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, and everyone else's descriptions of why that might be. I think when I think of writing, the one that's likely most popular that adults are doing is journaling. And I think journaling involves a lot of reminiscing, it involves a lot of deep reflection, and that can go, like you were saying, into a place that might feel initially negative, but then maybe once someone has walked away from a journaling experience, then they might have an increased sense of well-being. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? And again, we're continuing to be open to people from the audience who want to share either in the chat or by raising your Zoom hand. Rachel, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think part of this for me too is thinking through the role again of the facilitator or the educator, right? So like I think journaling on your own might have a particular impact, but from what I've seen, guided journaling and then also opportunities within that space to share out really helps people kind of metabolize the emotions that they're feeling in real time. And so that might be also an interesting study, future study, right, is to going back especially to the folks who were sharing that they've had really negative educational experiences, to look at guided versus unguided offerings as well.
Yeah, I love what Sheila's putting in the text. Thank you, Sheila. That oftentimes in art therapy, you can help people unlearn the practices that are taught in common educational systems. And I think, I know we have a book of poetry that I co-edited on human flourishing. And we had a book talk on it. And one of my colleagues brought her husband, didn't tell him what the book was about. And they arrived and he said, "Oh, by the way, what's this book talk on? What's the book about?" And she said, it's on poetry. He said, "Oh no, I can't believe you brought me to a book talk on a book of poetry." And she's like, "Well, why are you responding that way?" He said, "Because when I was in high school, we all had to find a poem and memorize it and, recite it in front of the class. It was terrible. It was terrible. It was horrible. It was horrifying, right?" And so he had that negative experience that he was carrying with him, from decades ago. About that. And I know obviously teachers aren't intending that, but oftentimes when we use arts and culture for educational or academic, let's say, outcomes, you read a novel to increase your vocabulary, or when you're in high school, you quickly learn that you're not supposed to read the novels for enjoyment, but rather for book reports, right? Then you're like, okay, this is not what arts and culture were primarily intended for. This is an academic appropriation or an academic use of them, which in itself is not necessarily a terrible thing, but it misses the bigger picture. And so helping to unlearn some of those practices, helping people to move into places of freedom can certainly enable people to connect with arts and culture for positive expressive reasons, as opposed to merely these academic reasons. And I do just want to underscore, and then we'll turn to our final question from Alina. I do want to underscore that we're not trying to say in any of this work that if you happen to feel bad, then that's a negative thing, right? So Rebecca, thanks for bringing this up. Negative, quote unquote, or unpleasant experiences, shall we say, unpleasant emotions are a part of life. And so, if I have appendicitis, I go in willingly to the hospital for surgery, and I thank the surgeon afterwards for saving my life. I do not ignore that. I do not say, "Oh, I'm feeling fine. Everything is going to be okay." If I merely affirm that I'm feeling fine, I will be feeling fine. No, we pay attention to the emotions that we have. We pay attention to what they're communicating to us. And there's a difference between paying attention and saying, "Let me go in and get this checked out," versus "Let me journal about this infinitely long and talk about how horrible my pain is," and never do anything about it, right? So I'm not knocking journaling. I think journaling I've journaled myself a lot. Journaling has a very important point. But if all it does is reinforces, or it's the kind of wallowing and doesn't, as you say, Rachel, get to that opportunity of, okay, let me now take action steps, or let me share, or let me kind of, what have I learned from this? What insights have come from this, right? So it's a tricky kind of position to be in, where we both want to respect the full range of our experience, while also cultivating healthy parts of it ourselves, and also in conjunction with others. Terrific. Alina, we've got time for one quick question. What do you have on your mind?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Chris and Rachel, for this beautiful conversation. Extremely important. I just have a question about something that Chris touched on, and the question is addressed to Rachel. I was wondering, so people do have a tendency to turn to the art that they are already familiar with, kind of like that reflects the situation that surrounds them in daily life. And I think maybe that could be one of the reasons why writing, for example, or TV, that is actually causing this deep reflection, or just kind of reflects on how the things are in terms of racial inequality in the world, which are not perfect. And I was just wondering, when, for example, an exhibit is created, and what are some strategies so that the people are aware, to bring awareness to the audience, but at the same time to give people more positive emotion, more of a kind of like motivate them for positive action rather than bring negative emotion just due to reflection on the current state of the situation? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. I'm processing. I'm thinking about what we've done in the recent past in terms of encouraging people to have a positive experience in the space with work that might be unfamiliar. And so I go back to the current exhibition that's up right now. It's called Joanna Piotrowska, Unseeing Eyes, Restless Bodies. It's black and white photography that tends to look really documentary style, and has people in positions that might be triggering to some, especially people who have had relationship troubles in the past, I would say, or issues around consent and permission really come up. And so in thinking through receiving that show, that's why it was so essential to actually, the solution was a journal. What a theme for today. But to have these guiding questions that would actually get people to think about how work is relating to them, right? So none of the questions are like, really, what do you see, or stay at what do you see? It's really, how is this making you feel? What memories does it bring up for you? And then within that, knowing that a lot of negative emotions might be coming up, I focused on questions that I thought might skew people towards the positive, right? So instead of focusing on when was the last time you felt unsafe or you had unwanted touch, it's who is someone whose presence gives you a sense of empowerment. If you were to hug them, like, what shape would your body take, right? And so really leading people towards presence and towards self-regulation techniques that might be a resource. And I don't have to name them as such, right? There's not a text in the booklet that says this is why these questions are here. But I really do believe those kinds of resources should be in art spaces more, because you often don't know what a person's experience is going to be with art they're familiar with, but especially art they're unfamiliar with, right? If I had to make an assumption, discomfort is probably one of the more prevalent emotions that people feel in art spaces. And so that's why it's such a central question, right? How do I create a sense of comfort? It was great to hear you say that I'm creating a sense of home, Christa, because I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm going for. My primary audience is like my family, right? If I can get my family to come in through our doors and be there, not just because I work there, right? That'll be a really successful day for me.
That's beautiful, Rachel. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to leave it, because we're out of time. We didn't even get to talk about Deanna Barton's really interesting comment about the impact of arts and cultural engagement in third spaces outside of traditional arts institutions. And Rachel, when you use the language of family in that kind of a way, it reminds me of, opportunities to engage outside of, and I'm sure that that's what you're hoping at the ICA, is that people take that experience with them as well, and explore further. There's a lot of gratitude in the chat. So Rachel and Christa, I hope that you're able to see that. I want to add my gratitude as well. Thank you to Christa Mahlobo and Rachell Morillo for joining us today and for giving us such thoughtful presentations and also insightful answers to our questions. It's really been an extraordinarily rich conversation. So thank you for your work and your presence and sharing today. I also want to thank Catherine Cotter, Associate Director of Research, and Sarah Sidoti, Associate Director of Operations in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, for all of their work behind the scenes. And finally, thanks to all of our audience and guests for joining us today. It's been terrific to have you with us. Our next In Conversation colloquium will start at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, October 10, 2024, just a couple of weeks away. It will feature Andrew Orr, Assistant Professor of Clinical Medicine at the University of California in San Francisco, and Susanna Niepold, Associate Director of Student and Educator Engagement at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. For more information on this and other upcoming colloquia sessions, we invite you to come up to sign up for our free newsletter, which you can do by visiting our website at www.humanitiesandhumanflourishing.org. And thanks, Sarah, for dropping that into the chat again. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, and be well.